Does WWE have some creative concerns regarding the direction of the Bloodline, but more specifically, the direction of the Bloodline with a new member about to be added to the mix? We all know we've been talking about the debut of Jacob Fatu, and everyone thought that could come at Backlash. Turned out it was not Jacob Fatu, as we know, with Tangaloa reuniting with Tama Tonga to join Solo Sikoa in this new rogue edition of the Bloodline. But we also know that before Backlash, there were reports out there that Jacob Fatu could debut as soon as the start of the WWE draft, that first edition of SmackDown when the draft kicked off. That didn't happen, and it was followed up by saying WWE is sort of now waiting to put Jacob Fatu into this storyline in whatever way they decide to do it. And again, we still wait. But a new little thing came out this week regarding where WWE could actually see Jacob Fatu and how that relates to Solo Sikoa. I'm going to pull it up here on the screen. From WrestleVotes on Twitter. Interesting tidbit here. Sources suggest that Solo Sikoa's recent aggressive streak is part of a strategy to establish him as the main force within this new phase of the Bloodline ahead of Jacob Fatu's debut. However, some trepidation remains within creative over fear that Fatu's presence could outshine Solo at this stage. So, that is interesting because, again, they have positioned Solo as sort of the leader of this version of the Bloodline, even if we still make our predictions and think that the ultimate leader of this thing is going to be unveiled as The Rock at some point down the road. The final boss, the high chief, whatever The Rock wants to label himself as, he could be the one pulling the strings, right? That's at least an argument you can make, given the fact that we've seen the Bloodline turn the way that they have without Roman Reigns in the mix. But, again, they've positioned Solo now in this spot. However, adding Jacob Fatu to the mix, if you're wanting to know why people are so hyped about the idea of Jacob Fatu joining this thing, and let's say you haven't seen a lot of Jacob Fatu stuff previously in MLW or anywhere else, well, there's a reason for that, because this guy is the real deal. Like, when you watch him perform, when you watch him wrestle, whether as a character, the in-ring stuff, there's a lot of good stuff there. And he's been doing this longer than Solo Sikoa. Let's also point that out. And that's obviously something, the more you've been doing it, that long, you're going to be able to sort of establish that persona and really that on-screen presence that maybe a Solo Sikoa, who is still early in his career, which is wild to think about because, remember, he got thrust right into the biggest story in the company very early into his career, wasn't in NXT that long. And so now you're going to bring in a Jacob Fatu and pair him on screen with Solo Sikoa, which, before we go into that a little bit further, because of the way this report sort of suggests, to me that tells me that we are heading towards Jacob Fatu joining Solo and Tama Tonga Tangaloa on that side of things. I've seen people talk about whether Jacob Fatu should now join Roman's side, right? Because you have Jacob Fatu join Roman and the Usos and all of that. I still don't think that's the best route you can go, because I just think, as sort of this hints at, the on-screen presence of Jacob Fatu, I just think you've got to have him sort of as the savage heel of this whole deal. Even though they've, again, tried to push, as you see here, Solo Sikoa is that, as Tama Tonga is that. They've tried to push everyone kind of in that same role. But this would suggest that they're definitely going to pair him with the heel side, this new version of the Bloodline, maybe rather than joining him up with Roman Reigns and whatever becomes of that version of the Bloodline whenever Reigns returns. But there's also something to the fact of looking at Solo's perspective here. And yes, he has become kind of front and center in this thing, although you guys know I still think the real front and center sort of star and character maybe of this thing, over the past several weeks at least, has been Paul Heyman, because Heyman is the one you have to play off of, knowing he's kind of the middleman, right, between Roman Reigns and between Solo and everything else that's going on that side of the Bloodline. But it is Solo who has been put in the position sort of as the de facto tribal chief for now, until, like I said, maybe you get The Rock come back, maybe you get, Roman comes back and they sort of have that square off, all that stuff. But the part of this too that's also interesting, I think, is I don't know if this is entirely Solo's fault. And that's, again, the thing where he doesn't have the experience that Jacob Fatu has. We understand that because he doesn't have that many years that Fatu does, on the wrestling scene. But it's also part, I think, of the role that he's had to play, right? I mean, Solo has never been positioned as sort of the guy. He's never been positioned in that spot where he has sort of this, really kind of layered character with all these little nuances and everything, the way that Roman Reigns was, because Reigns was the tribal chief and all that. Solo has been the enforcer for the most part in this Bloodline story, right? He has been the guy who is in the background. He's there to interfere. He's there to kind of, be physical with people who try to get physical with the Bloodline. And, sometimes that can kind of lead to a little bit of a one-dimensional character type situation. Not saying it's always been the case. We've seen Solo show a little bit of personality here or there, but it has still been a role where he's had to basically just be the guy who takes out the other guys, right? Every group for the most part, has had an enforcer, right? Like that's been his role. He hasn't had to be someone who's had all these little tiny, character things, or hasn't had to have the on-screen presence that a Roman Reigns has had, that even a Jimmy Uso or Jey Uso have had, right? He's not had to be in that spot. And so, yes, like when you put him right into this role after WrestleMania, and basically he's trying to replace Roman Reigns. Like that is what has happened here. He has been the one who has tried to replace the guy who had 4-year-long streak. He's been the leader of this hottest storyline in the company for years. And that's a tough spot to be in, to have to come right in and be able to, replace everything that Roman Reigns and Paul Heyman did from an on-screen chemistry standpoint. That's not easy. And like I said, remember, Solo is still, he's still younger. He's still growing on the job. Like, he's still developing, too, all of his skills. And not to say Jacob Fatu is not, but I think when you look at how maybe Jacob Fatu has been presented throughout his career in MLW or wherever else, sure, he has definitely established a persona that which is why everyone's so hyped about this. He's established one that is really making you want to see this guy as part of this savage version of the Bloodline, right? And whenever he steps, from behind the curtain onto the camera, he is going to look like a star. Like, he is immediately going to be someone that I think you will have fans that just gravitate to, just from the standpoint of being this badass potential heel guy who's just going around and just destroying people. And, that is sometimes very easy to get over when you kind of have the established experience and all that Jacob Fatu does have. So the fact that this is something that WWE, I don't know if concerned is maybe too strong of a word, but the fact that it is something that's on their mind, we'll see, right? How that leads to them positioning these two as they move forward. I've seen some other people sort of mention, hey, maybe this is actually an opportunity because you could still do everything you're going to do, and maybe that is where, at some point down the road, Jacob Fatu kind of takes over this thing. Solo gets pushed to the side, all of this, and maybe it is kind of a different version of Rock and Reigns, but you kind of have someone that gets pushed to the side. Maybe that eventually helps Solo in some way, shape, or form. But this is at least an interesting report here that it is something that could be on the mind of WWE Creative right now as they try to figure out exactly how to perfectly execute the debut of Jacob Fatu, who is going to add a new element to this entire story. And I think we still have big matches. If Fatu's joining this version, you still have Roman Reigns versus Jacob Fatu. You still have Roman Reigns versus Solo Sikoa. But there's also, the idea, too, that putting these two together on screen, putting Jacob Fatu with Solo Sikoa, is only going to make Solo Sikoa better and give them an opportunity to build their own kind of on-screen chemistry and all that. So, it's an interesting discussion, I think, that will be had, especially once we actually see Jacob Fatu joining the Bloodline and see how the roles and the dynamics with the power all start to change. And, we'll see if Solo is kind of positioned as the leader, he's the main man in front, or is it inevitable that Jacob Fatu makes his way into that position and he starts to be the one that leads the way? There's at least storyline reasons you can go with either, and you can make it work to lead to bigger matches down the road and all that. But I at least found it, somewhat fascinating that this is where WWE is at right now, and maybe that's part of the reason why they've decided to hold off this Jacob Fatu debut to try to figure out how they want to go about pairing him with Solo Sikoa or whatever else they decide. So there you go. There's some thoughts on that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button as well. What are your thoughts on this potential rumor out there that WWE could be a little bit hesitant about putting Jacob Fatu and Solo Sikoa together, and how do you think they will play off of each other on screen moving forward with the Bloodline?